This is an exclusive excerpt from the Stuph File Program with Peter Anthony Holder.
Foreign correspondent Ivor Davis is back on the show with us. We've talked to him before about several books and issues. He wrote Manson Exposed, a reporter's 50-year journey into madness and murder. And he also wrote The Beatles and Me on Tour. It's that latter title that we are circling back to because 2024 means it's the 60th anniversary of his being embedded with the Beatles on their triumphant 1964 North American tour. So, once again, to talk to us about the Fab Four, Ivor joins us via Zoom from California. Hi, Ivor.
Good morning from California. Lovely to talk to you again, Peter. And isn't it amazing? 60 years since they hit Montreal, since they hit Toronto, since they hit North America. And we never knew, any of us, that we'd be talking about them as we are 6 decades later. It boggles the mind, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Now, we spoke to you, I believe it was the same month. It was February of 2015 we spoke to you about this book, and now you've put out this 60th anniversary edition of it. So what's different between when we last spoke and the book that's currently out now?
Well, the amazing thing is, since then, I hit the road and I decided to include more background to why I wrote my original book. And I mean, it's amazing that today the Beatles are almost bigger than they were back then. And you can't turn on, they had a hit record a few months ago, Now and Then. Remember that?
Right, yes.
And so, I mean, AI helped. So did Peter Jackson. And the record went to number one. I mean, you couldn't write that. If you wrote it, they wouldn't believe it. So the difference is I've got so much more material. I mean, I like to go kind of a little bit offbeat. And a lot of people will ask me, well, how much are the Beatles worth, for example? Well, first of all, you may not believe this, but every day, without getting out of bed, Paul and Ringo make about less than $50,000 a day from royalties and from Beatle likenesses, and that the estates collect that money. It's phenomenal. They don't do anything. And then, of course, we're not counting about Paul's tours, Paul's photo books, Paul's marketing genius, Ringo's concerts. They earn a few shillings extra. And what I enjoyed saying, I don't want to go on too long, but I know what I enjoyed saying was, well, Paul McCartney is the richest rock star in the world. He is now worth about $1.3 billion. But watch out, Paul, because Taylor Swift is 1.1 billion catching you up. And the other funny thing I felt was that poor Ringo, poverty-stricken Ringo, is only worth $400 million. So, you know, if you would have said to the Beatles back then that this would have been the case and predicted it, they would have said, you know, you've got to be crazy. You're a loony bin. You're crazy. Get out of the room. So some of the things, and I enjoyed going into Paul McCartney's background and the fact that, you know, how has he made his money? Because people like to know that. And I must tell you a very quick story, if I may. Do we have time for a quick story about Paul?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I heard, I live in Southern California, and I heard that Paul McCartney had bought a house in Malibu. So I called up some of my sources and nobody knew anything. And then by pure chance, I met a guy I met on who lived on the Chicago area. His name was Don DeFore. He was the son of the actor Ron DeFore, who I'd never heard of because he was a star in the 50s. Anyway, so we had dinner in Malibu, and we were at a beachside cafe in Malibu. And Ron said Ivor Davis traveled with the Beatles, and the manager got very excited. He said, you should have been in last night because Paul McCartney came in with his wife, Nancy. And I thought, wow, isn't that amazing? What a coincidence. So Paul McCartney has bought a house, and I use the term loosely, a house in Malibu. And the manager of the restaurant, who knows what's going on, said to me, Paul McCartney paid $5.5 million for a new house in Malibu on the cliff top. It's a mobile home park home. So Paul McCartney also has a mobile home park home in Malibu. He coughed up $5.5 million. End of the story is, having dinner, I see a young waitress in the about 27, 28. And I ask her, were you here when Paul came in last night with Nancy, his wife? And she said, yes, but I didn't recognize him. I said, well, what did you recognize? She said, well, all I can tell you, he was a nice old British gentleman with a white beard. So all of your listeners out there who know gentlemen with white beards, there's hope for us. We could be Paul McCartney. But I thought it was a funny story because that's the way somebody who didn't know Paul described him.
Now, you were, for this book and for your reporting back in the day, you were embedded with the Beatles during that tour, and that's why the book is called The Beatles and Me on Tour. We talked a little bit about your journalism, both in talking about this book in the past and also talking about the Manson book. But I want to burrow down a little bit in this. Where exactly were you in your career at the time that you were first embedded with the Beatles?
Well, it was 1964. I had been appointed West Coast correspondent for the London Daily Express. And the London Daily Express at that time had about 4.5 million readers per day. And those were the days, Peter, when people actually read newspapers. And so I was West Coast correspondent, a newbie on the job. And the editor called me up from London and said, get on the plane to San Francisco. The boys are coming to America. And I said, who are the boys? And he said, they're the Beatles. And I knew very little about the Beatles. All I knew was that in February of that year, 1964, I'd seen them on the Ed Sullivan Show. And the astonishing thing was, and many people remember that, of a certain age, and they attracted 74 million viewers on the Ed Sullivan Sunday night show. So that's all I knew. So I got to San Francisco. I showed up at the Hilton Hotel. There were about 500 young women screaming outside. I went into the hotel. I said, I'd like a room for tonight. And they said, we're full up. I said, I'm with the Beatles. And they said, oh, different. Okay. And they gave me a room. And I went out and Derek Taylor, their press agent, who actually had worked for my newspaper before he went to work for the Beatles, introduced me to the jet-lagged Beatles, who grunted and said and barely said hello to me. They were watching color television, and they were using a remote changer to change the channels, which they didn't have in England. They kind of ignored me for the first 24 hours, but once they knew I was sort of part of the family and on the trip from beginning to end, suddenly the doors opened like magic, and I could wander into their rooms. I could raid their mini bar. I could talk to them whenever I wanted to. It's the kind of access that journalists today never get with rock stars. So I was off to a rather shaky start, but once they realized I was a member of the family, they were the Beatle family. It was a great welcome, and it went better, and I could see what went on on the Beatles. And I was in limousine number 2. They were in limousine number 1. We raced through the countryside. We raced to the airport. We had a private jet, which I traveled on. And it was an amazing trip.
Well, the reason why I asked what point were you in your career is because I was just wondering, when you first got this gig and you were told you're going to be traveling with the Beatles for their tour, were you a junior reporter? Were you a big star reporter? Was this the biggest thing that had happened in your career at that time? Or was this just another story to follow?
Well, it was another story to follow, I must admit. I was very lucky to get the job as West Coast correspondent for the London newspaper. And I was covering stories like the divorce of Marlon Brando. If there was a story in Australia, they sent me to Australia. And I covered politics. I covered everything. I mean, showbiz was very important. And as I said, I covered the divorces of Cary Grant and Marlon Brando, very showbiz oriented. But I didn't realize then, of course, that the Beatle trip was going to be a rather a momentous news story in my life. And when I got there, as I said, when history is unfolding, I mean, when I say you, I mean the individual, doesn't really realize its history until years later. So, yes, the answer to your question is, I've been doing Hollywood stories, I've been doing news stories, whenever there was a big story in the West Coast of America, because we had a bureau in Washington, we had a bureau in New York, and I was the one-man bureau in LA, and I was a lucky fella to, stumble in a way over these stories. It was never planned, because I think careers are never planned. I would say, Peter, your own career, did you plan to do what you do when you were younger?
From the time I was 7, actually.
Well, that's remarkable, don't you think?
I don't think it that way. I'm kind of surprised that most people don't follow their passion from the time that they're 7.
No, that is most remarkable. 7 years of age is formidable and phenomenal for you to say, here's what I want to do at the age of 7. So I was going to say, what somebody or something or a person must have inspired you to decide to go to become a famous podcaster or a famous interviewer. How did you, I'm sorry I turn it on you, but how did you decide at such a tender age to do what you're doing?
I just loved listening to the radio, and I loved the people who were on the radio, and I thought that's something I want to do. It sounded like they were having fun. So basically that was it.
Yeah, that's right. Well, then that makes sense. And even though, look, in my own career, before I got a job on a newspaper, I kid you not, I wrote 60 letters to just about every newspaper in England to ask for a job, and I got 59 rejections. And then one newspaper called me in and said, come in and see us, and they, you hit it off with the editor and you get the job. You never know. So I always try to tell, and I'm sure you do, whenever you speak publicly, that tell young journalists, young broadcasters to pursue your dream if you really have a passion for it.
Absolutely. Now, Ivor, you said earlier that when you first met the Beatles, there was a bit of a disconnect that they just kind of grunted and you had to basically earn their trust. What was it like gaining the trust of the Beatles, and what did you have to do to get there?
Well, I must tell you that very early in the tour, the Beatles in Las Vegas ran into a bit of hot water. A mother of a young girl, a 14-year-old girl, called the cops on them in Las Vegas, claiming that her daughter had been purloined by the Beatles. She was underage, and the sheriffs came in, they investigated, and everything was cleared. But that could have been disastrous for the Beatles. And I never actually wrote about the investigation into whether the Beatles were seeing underage young women. So in a way, because nothing came of it, they knew they could trust me. And to be honest with you, I knew later on that if I wrote negative stories about the Beatles, their manager, Brian Epstein, would say, thank you for joining us, Ivor, but there's no more ticket to ride for you. So I knew that I had to mind my P's and Q's, but that was okay because, you don't tell tales out of school on your friends or people that you know. And by that time, I'd become very friendly with the Beatles.
Now, the last time we spoke about the Beatles, I asked you about the Screaming Girls, and I figure I want to go a different direction this time, and that is, we hear all the time about the Screaming Girls, and you even talked about meeting some of the women when they were older and their recollections of being part of the Screaming Girls. But the Beatles also have a lot of male fans. So what was it like interacting with the male fans? Because I'm sure they wanted to hear the music as opposed to the screaming.
Yes, well, that's true. And that's a good question because nobody has actually asked me that question ever in all the interviews I've done. I think there was an element, don't forget, if the young male fans went with their girlfriends or lady friends, they may have been a bit jealous, to be honest, because all of a sudden these young women were going gaga for Paul or for George or for Ringo. So I'm going to turn the question around a little bit because I remember talking to Colonel Tom Parker. Now, Colonel Tom Parker is that canny carnival huckster man who became Elvis Presley's manager. Everybody knows him, of course. And Parker was a real carnival guy, and he told me he used to sell stickers and sell stickers to the girls that said "I love Elvis" and to the boys who said "I hate Elvis." And he sold quite a few "I hate Elvis" stickers to the boyfriends. So that doesn't answer your question, but I think, I mean, frankly, there was a preponderance of women in the audience, and the boys didn't scream. They just held the hands of their young ladies and hoped that they would not get too gaga over the Beatles. So the best thing I can do to answer your question about the boys, and some of them who were musically inclined and weren't caught up by the passion of it all, love the Beatle music, but it was the girls that ruled the wave.
Well, I asked the question only because, like I said, the last time I spoke to you, you did talk about the fact that you had the opportunity to talk to some women who were in love with the Beatles when they were screaming madly for them during those tours. And I was just curious to know, clearly the women wanted to date the Beatles. I'm sure there were guys who wanted to be the Beatles.
Yes, that's an interesting question. The only people that wanted to be the Beatles was Elton John, Sting, and people like that. People who were so heavily influenced by the Beatle music of the males. I mean, they were blown away, they told me. Sting said, as soon as he heard the first Beatles song, he knew that this is what he wanted to do. So and Sting wasn't a young man in the audience at the time, but so I think the guys were impressed to want to duplicate the Beatles in the music world. And as you correctly pointed out, I spoke to some of these ladies years later, and they said they genuinely thought at the time that when Paul smiled, he smiled at her. And these were not kind of frothy-headed bubblegum kids. These were mature ladies in executive jobs who talked about that. So somehow the Beatles generated sexual excitement for the girls, but not so much for the boys.
Now, I happened to come across in doing a little bit of research in the last little while in planning to talk to you, I came across something that is a standard 3-page Beatles Rider. And it was a contract for when they played in Portland, Oregon. And I found the rider very interesting. People know what the riders are. It's the contract that explains exactly what the person who promotes the show has to do and what the venue has to do. And one of the things that I found very, very interesting, element number 5, and I didn't expect to see this, and I didn't necessarily see it on other bands or acts riders. Number 5 was, artists will not be required to perform before a segregated audience.
Ah, yes. Yeah, this is an interesting point because when we went down to Jacksonville, the situation of a segregated audience came up. And I will say, I remember that vividly. We were on the plane, and I think John was sitting looking at a newspaper headline and a picture. And I remember that picture vividly. It was a white cop holding back a ferocious-looking dog from attacking a black protester. And John looked at that and was disgusted by it. And then when we went to Florida, before we went to Jacksonville, because we went to Jacksonville, we were detoured to Key West, Florida because of the hurricane. John said, I'm not going to play. And Paul said, we're not going to play to segregated audiences. Now, it's interesting because the audience at Jacksonville was not segregated, but I remember seeing a terrific documentary that made by Ron Howard, I think it was called 8 Days a Week. And in it, there was a beautiful young woman who got into the Beatles concert in Jacksonville in that period. That was in 1964. And she said she got into the concert and she sat by herself among a very white audience, and she knew she had to keep her mouth shut. I mean, that gives you some indication about the atmosphere in America at the time. But the Beatles certainly did not want to play to any segregated audience, and they told Brian that, and they never did, because you know. But the amazing thing is, and you must know this because Peter, you have done a lot of research and you're an expert in those fields, that I would say that the preponderance of Black or even Hispanic members of the audience was very, very, very small. And in a way, I would say, I haven't said this before, but I would say that the Beatles mostly performed in 1964 to a white bread audience. Not many Negroes, as they were called back then, were in the audience, but there were a few. But so the Beatles were politically aware, particularly John and Paul, and they were the ones that said to Brian, we're not going to play if the audience is segregated, and it was not segregated. So that's sort of the answer to your question.
You mentioned the fact that the Beatles were on the charts again recently. There has been a renaissance of the Beatles, which is perfectly timed again for your book, but also there was a series of documentaries and a series of films about the Beatles. I believe in one of the more recent ones, there was an old interview of you in that documentary. What did you feel about the renaissance of the Beatles?
Well, it was funny because, yes, you're right. I excuse me, I had a sound bite. Somebody sent me a sound bite, and I was I was not gushing, but I was very respectful. And it was done in 1964 by a guy called Ed Rudy, R-U-D-Y, who was on the tour in New York. And he asked me about the Beatles, and I gave him a benign, nice answer. But I didn't gush, and I just said there were four good-looking guys who were doing tremendously well. They were not full of their own self-importance. They were not bullshitters. They were pretty down to earth about life. And that's what I liked. Even though they were getting this rock star acclaim, it didn't go to their heads. Now, did it go to their heads later? You tell me. What do you think?
I really don't think so. I mean, there was that whole controversy of John saying that he was bigger than Jesus, but I think he was misquoted.
Yes.
He was misquoted.
Yes, he was. He was. And the interesting thing is about that quote, because that was really the quote that almost destroyed the Beatles, because it was published in London and nobody said a word. But as soon as he came over, I think it was in 1966, which was the last year, America was furious. And in the Deep South, where the Beatles performed, they burnt the Beatle records. And John and Paul and the rest of the boys decided this was not the climate they wanted to perform in, and this was their last year on tour ever together as Beatles. So yes, you're right. I don't know, it all seems antique when we talk about it today, that the Beatles are now, as I say, bigger than ever. And I may have somewhere along the way, and I apologize, Peter, but I may have lost the answer to your question, but I hope some of what I said makes sense.
Absolutely. And I could talk to you forever, but we're just about out of time. And I think it's very, very important, especially for Beatles fans, to get the 60th anniversary version of your book, which is called The Beatles and Me on Tour. You can go down memory lane, you can go down penny lane, you can go down any lane you want to with this book. Ivor, it's always a pleasure to have you on the program and talk to you. You're an absolute delight, sir. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Peter. Keep doing what you do so well, and a pleasure to be with you again.
Ivor Davis, author of The Beatles and Me on Tour, 60th Anniversary Edition. That man is always a delight to talk to. You can go to my website at thestufffile.com, check out the show number for this program, which is show number 0758, and you'll find the link to Ivor's site, plus links to either Amazon.com or Amazon.ca, where you can order his book directly.
You've just heard an exclusive excerpt from the Stuph File Program with Peter Anthony Holder. To hear any or all of the full hour-long shows, visit thestufffile.com. Stuph is spelled S-T-U-P-H. That's thestufffile.com. A presentation of Flying Fish Communications.